I think I heard her say the loneliness. I think that's a typo because whenever you're with Kiran Desai, you think it must be the loveliness. Oh. So, okay, listen. Some of us are from a cricket playing country. Simon's country beat us, unfortunately, the other day. But right now, I'm happy to report India is on a very easy path of victory against Pakistan. Very good.
What?
130, 190 for no loss. Excellent. So listen, cricket matches start with the toss of a coin. And we need to employ that technique today because Kiran said that she couldn't decide between two passages that she could, because I asked her to read something and she couldn't decide between two passages. I said, we'll toss the coin. Heads or tails, all right? So you decide which one will be heads, which one will be tails.
Okay, the choice was, which I couldn't make up my mind, that's why I'm a little late. The choice was a passage between an Indian boy fighting with his Midwestern girlfriend or a visiting Englishman in Delhi, in a Delhi household, and an Englishman comes to dinner.
Okay.
Very different passages. And so tails.
So Indian boy fighting with his Midwestern girlfriend is heads.
Okay.
And the Englishman visiting India is tails. Now what happens in the cricket matches is that the umpire walks to the center and then he does like that, and it falls, and then he says, and the heads. So Indian boy fighting with his Midwestern girlfriend wins.
Okay.
All right.
I have to find it.
While you find it, I'll try to introduce you in a way befitting. I mean, basically, I was thinking, there are many writers in the world. There are only few very fine writers. And there are many good people in the world. I hope I am to be counted among them. But there are only very few very good people. And where these two circles overlap, there stands Kiran Desai. First thing,
Look at
Indians of a certain vintage.
Amitabh, what am I going to have to pay you?
Indians of a certain vintage will remember Dilip Kumar introducing Lata Mangeshkar in the Royal Albert Hall. How many of you know who Lata Mangeshkar is? All right, very good, very good. Dilip Kumar, he's an old actor, wonderful actor. You know, people like my mother would have been in love with him. And he says something like this, and I'll translate it. It's very quick. He said, जिस तरह फूल की खुशबू का कोई रंग नहीं होता, वो महज खुशबू होती है. In the same way as the fragrance of a flower doesn't have a color, it is only a fragrance. जिस तरह पानी के झरने का या फिर ठंडी हवाओं का कोई घर, गांव, वतन नहीं होता. In the same way as the flowing waters of a river or cool breezes do not have a home, a nation, a country or borders. जिस तरह सूरज की किरणों का या किसी बच्चे की मुस्कान का कोई मजहब नहीं होता, भेदभाव नहीं होता. In the same way as the rays of a rising sun or the smile of a child does not have a religion or a creed or a prejudice. उसी तरह लता मंगेशकर की आवाज कुदरत की तख्लीक का एक करिश्मा है. So he says, in that same way, the voice of Lata Mangeshkar is a miracle of nature. Cool? So there you have in essence my description of Kiran Desai's nearly natural grasp of narrative, of broad range of emotions, and tying them together in producing always, always memorable stories. So, welcome.
Well, thank you, all of you, so much. Amitabh, most of all, he told me in the author's lounge he is going to introduce me with light praise. Halki si. But, yeah, thank you so much. So, let's hope this lives up to this introduction. I had never heard myself read this out loud. one of the main characters of this novel I'm working on is called Sunny. The title of the new book is called The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny. And so this little passage features Sunny and his girlfriend Una. The first days of living with a girlfriend, everything had been surprising. The fact, for example, that Una and Sunny had different ideas of privacy. Astonished to find no lock on the bathroom door of their new home, Sunny rushed, expecting Una to come in at any moment, which she often did, wandering in that first innocent summer, to chat about trivial matters while cleaning her ears, or if Sunny was in the shower, even nonchalantly peeing. When he went to the hardware store to buy a latch, she collapsed into giggles. "How can you be so shy?" She threw off all her clothes and wandered about the apartment, delighted by the Brooklyn sunshine. "The neighbors can see you." "Lucky them," she said, leaving Sunny half scandalized, half awed by this country that made women who were so at ease in their skin. Meanwhile, when Sunny returned from the supermarket with a proud yellow jar of Grey Poupon Dijon mustard, the kind that had a label saying made with white wine, Una refused to ladder it along a Hebrew national hot dog, which she had taught Sunny was the only brand he should trust. "Why do you care? You're not Jewish," he had said, thinking how lucky she was to be with a Hindu who ate beef. She had no idea. "Doesn't matter, it's the best," she insisted. "What's wrong with this mustard?" he now asked. "I don't like fancy mustard. I like plain brown Heinz mustard if I must eat mustard." "It's far easier," Una said on another occasion, "for you to say you're from Delhi than for me to say I'm from Hill City, Kansas. New York favors foreigners, and it's harder to be an American from the Midwest than a foreigner from another country." In fact, when she had gone to Europe for a summer and was asked where she was from, she said New York, not Kansas, betraying the place she loved and could enchant Sunny with by recalling a land so flat and empty you could see your friends arrive from hours away, where the wind never stopped gusting. It could lift your shirt over your head and whoosh it across the landscape when you stepped outside. She knew tumbleweed, and she knew prairie chickens scattering across the road. She knew 2 wizened hunchback sisters who persisted in a ghost town. No other living residents in the hamlet settled by slaves during abolition times. Once a car had come down the street with no driver, and all the children had shrieked until the tallest of them saw a tiny lady at the wheel, her face too low to look through the windshield. Sunny couldn't drive, he couldn't dance. He was unversed in all popular culture. But he never admitted any of these things. They became apparent. He fills the dishwasher with ordinary laundry detergent, and when Una came home, the kitchen was high in sudsy water. And she sloshed about singing until she realized he was so embarrassed he appeared on the verge of tears. She showed him how to open milk cartons, buy fabric softeners and drying sheets, how to get a phone installed, how to work elevators with security keys, how to use train ticket machines, unclog drains with Drano. She gave him all the information on American life you couldn't get from having read A Perfect Day for Banana Fish, or Two Strange Ladies, or The Confederacy of Dunces. These books had not been practically useful, but the eccentricity of America and Americans as conveyed by them was what had first powerfully drawn Sunny to this country. If she enjoyed her role too much to be discreet about it, Una was nevertheless kind and painstaking. "Say A," she said. "Say B." She tutored Sunny to pronounce words so he would be understood. Vegetable, not vegetable. She taught him to say good when asked how he was instead of terrible, because nobody likes a depressed person. "I do," said Sunny. But by then Una had gathered momentum and was collecting proof he avoided words like bra or pantyhose. "Say it," she would insist. It was presented as a game, but he experienced it as a taunt. And meanwhile, as he more intractably refused and nurtured the beginnings of resentment, Una began to feel oppressed in turn. "If you tried to dance," she said with some bitterness, You might like to dance. Why don't you eat fish? Responded Sunny. I come from the Midwest, that's why. We only eat fish once or twice a year. And every mouthful my mom would warn, watch out for bones, because it is true, you do keep getting bones. Eating fish makes me nervous. She drinks milk, Sunny reported to a marveling Satya, this is his best friend. Whole glasses of it with her meals. Not only did Una sip milk with her meals, Sunny had discovered she considered a simmering complexity of sauces, a mix of spices, a rara, a gassi, or a simple dal ghosh were barbarous inventions. Should one puddle of brown begin to run across the plate to join with another puddle of brown, she felt fear. When they went out to eat, although she was too scared to openly say so and send Sunny on a rampage against those who didn't care for puddles of yellow and brown, she prayed with all her concentrated might that the restaurant they happened upon would be Italian. It was true then that there had been something to Satya's warning. This is again his friend. They could each be stung at various times by inadequate cosmopolitan flair, but they rested their pride, they began to notice, on their vulnerabilities, on refusing to give up what, perhaps, they most hoped to lose. And what they most wanted to lose then was what they fought most for and what most defined them. At a certain point, it became a tragedy. A tragedy when you took the wider perspective and considered the fact that Sunny belonged to the first generation of men in India who actually cooked and didn't just give direction to women and servants while grabbing the praise. Like you, Amitava. Actually cooks. Whatever I eat, I find he slipped curry in there, Una announced in the indulgent tones of the owner of an odd person to a group of friends gathered at a tapas restaurant to celebrate the birthday of Una's friend Natalina, while one of the women used the occasion of having an Indian at the table to retell a story of her recent trip to India. I traveled alone, she said. Although nobody could believe I was going to do this, you have never seen anything so crazy in your life. The plane caught fire, and my God, being a blonde woman in India, they just go mad. They cannot conceive of you as a person. I had to take the train after the plane caught fire. A man on the platform reached through the train window and grabbed my breasts, and as the train began to leave the station, he ran along with the train, still holding on. Sunny steadied a slight tremble in his hands by very precisely slicing a bacalao croquette and delivering it neatly into his mouth using knife and fork. Wasn't there a suggestion that he was in some way responsible in a long series of associations? He felt insulted and guilty, then annoyed at having to feel guilty or insulted, especially while eating at a restaurant in the West Village that would gouge his bank account. On the occasions of her friends being present, Una preferred for him to pay. When they were alone, she often paid graciously and generously. A friend of mine told me that when she went to India, the hotel staff would come up and hammer on her door in the middle of the night, Sunny said, delivering now a slice of cold frittata into his mouth in such a manner to place himself at a far civility from his nation, to prove with his table manners, familiarity with the foods of Spain, and his sympathy for women travelers, that he was not like those men to be found on every street corner in India. The woman continued, men would stare at me with their mouths open as if I were a freak. This one guy in a bus turned around in his seat and didn't take his eyes off me for a whole 7 hours. Meanwhile, I was trying to set up this rural non-profit. Were they not all variations upon the same urge, Sunny with Una, the man in the bus, staring with something beyond lust, for he'd become only eyes and exited himself entirely? What kind of non-profit center? Asked Sunny, wondering at the back of his mind if lust by definition must include an element of hope, no matter how much the hope was imagined. We were teaching women to make solar ovens so they don't have to use so much firewood. They could come back after working in their fields and find their rice already cooked. But it was hard to do anything. Even the women would crowd about wanting to touch my skin, my hair. Sometimes I wanted to yell, get me a burqa. Did you get sick? Asked someone. When I went to the doctor, he was like, you have everything. The shrieks around the table, but she assured Sunny. After Equatorial Guinea, India was like Chicago. At home, Sunny said, Una, why did you say I put curry in everything? I put spices in everything, not curry in everything. She thought Sunny had left for work when she telephoned her mother. He says he doesn't put curry in everything, and yet he does. As Sunny moved closer to listen as gingerly and slowly as possible, the floorboard made an equivalently slow moan, and Una switched hastily to talk about the weather forecast that predicted the year's first snowfall might arrive by midnight. I heard what you said, jig of brows. You were eavesdropping. Maligning people is the worst crime. Picking a golden Pomerania tomato from the bowl, he brought it down precisely on the table to make his point. No, it's awful to be a snoop. She laid down the banana pepper. You're making me feel guilty so as to divert attention from what you were saying. How was it that in the Western world, listening and uncovering a crime was a worse crime than the actual crime? He'd noticed this while editing and reading thousands of news articles. Her civilization was built upon snooping, not snooping, and wandering about naked. His civilization was based on donning your clothes but listening to every conversation openly. How on earth had it come to pass, in this Brooklyn idyll of triumphant multiracial calm, they'd reached such distrust as had unpicked their love, if it were love, that is, because if it were, they would surely not have unraveled it so crudely, so simply, when the love of others triumphed over world wars, genocide, debilitating illness, alcoholism, visa denials, financial failures, religious differences, and prison sentences. I'm wondering whether... I think I'm going to stop here, because I can carry on forever. Thank you.
That is great. I was going to ask you a little bit about where these stories are coming from, but first I have to tell you something. At breakfast today, I asked anyone who sat next to me, what should be the question for Kiran? And I chose the best one. The best question that was offered to me was, the winner was Sabrina Dhawan, the writer of Monsoon Wedding. She said, ask her, how can a person who is so seemingly undamaged become a writer?
Oh, well, Sabrina obviously doesn't know me very well. I'm extremely damaged, but I won't go into that. I would say that I think the reason one becomes a writer is sometimes, the reasons for one becoming a writer happen before one's even born. And I would say that I became a writer for stories that happened before I was ever before anyone ever imagined I would be around at all. So I would talk a little bit perhaps about family stories that have informed my work. These are old family stories. And while you won't see an echo in the passage I read, there are echoes throughout the book I'm working on, and even perhaps in this passage I read, although hard to find. So on my father's side, on my last book, there's a character of a judge, a very dark character who lives up on the mountainside alone, whose face is like a mask. And I based it somewhat on the story of my grandfather, who had grown up in a small town in Gujarat called Naryad, and on the outskirts of Naryad, not a wealthy family. And somehow, because there were scholarships being offered to study in England, he decided he would apply for one of them and there was no electricity in the house, and he sat under a street lamp. This is what he always told us, that he sat under a street lamp in the street outside and learnt the English dictionary by heart. He won one of these scholarships. He sailed to England. He sat for the entrance examination to Cambridge, got into Cambridge, sat for the entrance exams to the Indian Civil Service, got into the civil service, and if you joined the ICS, as it was known, you would be immediately, you would enter this elite class that was called the Heaven-born. They lived such a extraordinary life, and he returned to India as a member of this class, transforming himself from a vegetarian Hindu into a Western gentleman. He gave up religion completely, entirely. He learned to eat with knife and fork. He learned how to shoot a gun. He learned how to ride horseback. And he went back to my grandmother, who he'd married when she was age 13. And she was his second wife, which was common in those days. His first wife had died. I think he'd married her when she was about 7. And this was quite a common story at that time. And my grandmother didn't speak a word of English and never did. She did learn some Hindi. And she had to join my grandfather, and they set off on, these cross-country trips that you would cross the state, they were posted to the state of Uttar Pradesh. And they went round in a caravan of bullock carts, holding court under the trees, taking the carpets, the chickens, the servants, everyone was packed into the bullock carts and transported. And my father, therefore, was sent to boarding school at age 4, and for some reason they sent him to Miss Oliphant's School for Girls, which traumatized him for the rest of his life. And he remembered Miss Oliphant for the rest of his life, the fright of Miss Oliphant. So he would come home and didn't share a language at all with his mother. They talked in Hindi, but his reading, writing language was English. And I think I mentioned yesterday in yesterday's panel, she read one book in her entire life, and it was Gandhi's Autobiography, and she always said, I read the best book. It's the best book I ever read. So, you're talking of these huge journeys and at the end of it all, when they'd lived through 2 world wars, the partition of India, which of course was such a traumatic event with 12 million people exiled, the landscape of the north transformed. The end of it, his face was really a mask. And after a lifetime of dispensing justice under a very flawed colonial system, he was a judge in British India.
So that one is a very touching portrait
Yes.
in inheritance of loss.
Yes.
In the new one, you are drawing on another side of the family or the same side of the family or other
I'm
mixings?
drawing also on my mother's side, which has another rather extraordinary story.
Please
We
tell
all
us,
have
tell
them.
us, tell us, tell us,
I'll
tell us
tell
a
you,
little bit.
and I'll try and tell you briefly. But my grandfather on my mother's side was from Dhaka, went to study engineering in Berlin in the 1920s, happened to be walking down the street, was stopped by a sculptor who asked if he could cast some bronzes of him. And he was a poor student, said yes, went to sit for this sculptor who cast 2 bronzes, one of his face, and it was called Face of a Young Indian, and another of his torso, called Torso of a Young Indian. When I went to Berlin some years ago, I saw for the first time, I went to the museum where these bronzes are still kept, and saw the naked torso of the grandfather I'd never met, who died long before I was born. And this sculptor turned out to be a man named Georg Kolbe. And Georg Kolbe became one of the preferred sculptors for the Nazis. And he was interested in race types. So he had not only sculpted head of a young Indian, but also head of a young Japanese, head of a young Chinese. And he was in the list, the Reich, they had a list of their preferred artists, and he was one of them. And he was responsible for sculpting those Aryan nymphs that decorated their buildings. He, however, also introduced my grandfather to my grandmother, and she was a newspaper editor's daughter in Berlin, sailed to India as a subject of the British Empire, arrived in a country that would very soon go to war with Germany, alongside the British, marry into a family where several members were fighting for independence against the British, and everything a contradiction except the one thing, the personal story against all this history and all these wars, which is, of course, the place of a novelist. My mother describes, hearing about the end of the war, and just remembering the fact that she couldn't communicate with her family for years. Germany and Britain, they were completely cut off. They would go to the post office and mail coffee, tea, sugar into the emptiness, and never heard back. The end of the war, she said, she saw this combination of emotions on her mother's face: shame, relief. She never went back to Germany. She became an Indian citizen, wore a sari, spoke in Hindi. But she heard that the family home had been bombed in Charlottenburg. There really wasn't the men in the family. There weren't any close brothers, but the men in the family had joined the army. There was a complete break. My grandfather lost his property in Dhaka, never fought for its return, lost his job. He worked for a German engineering firm. They became penniless. She lost a home in Germany. He lost his home in Dhaka. And of course and I think my grandfather apparently never recovered, never fought for the return, became very depressed. So as a child, I didn't know any of this, of course. I wasn't aware of these stories. But I was aware of a dark strain. And I think as a child, you inherit your parents' sadness that they've received from their parents, and you receive their sense of dislocation, and you receive the losses that have built up. And then you go on, you move into a world that, of course, it wasn't an unnatural thing that I left India. There's no surprise given these stories. It just seemed as if it was so many of us are here. Why are we here? Because many very old things happened that made it natural for us to move and not even to feel at home in our own country. To have been educated to leave and to have assigned the center elsewhere. So when I'm writing this book called The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny, everyone immediately thinks it's only about romantic loneliness, but it isn't. It's also about this kind of loneliness.
Thank you. The other thing I wanted to ask you, just as you were speaking, was that your own mother, and many people, of course, must be aware that Kiran is Anita Desai's daughter. Anita Desai, a wonderful writer who shaped many of our sensibilities. She has also written about some of these histories in a way, because when she's written about Baumgartner's Bombay, do you want to tell us a little bit about how your story is told differently, or how there are overlapping themes or departures, what you're doing differently?
It's so hard for me to say what I'm doing differently, because after I finish a book, which I think is entirely different from my mother's work, I read her work and I begin to see extremely close parallels. And when I wrote my last book and I read, actually it was Salman Rushdie who pointed this out and said she owes her mother's fire on the mountain a huge debt. And it's true when I look at it. But I can't tell you now, but I do know that she did write a book called Baumgartner's Bombay about a Jewish refugee who came through India and was thrown into a prisoner of war camp because, bizarrely, if you were a German citizen, even if you were a Jew in India, you were considered an enemy, and you were put into a prisoner of war camp for years at a time sometimes. It was I think she was corresponding with a professor in Israel who had made this journey. It's based on a real person. But yes, I think when I look at her and I look at her work and the influence she's had on me, and I think of why she became a writer, I do have to think of her parents' stories and her growing up in Old Delhi when she said the publishing world was so small. If you were writing in English, this is a very particular thing to English, writers writing in English. I think in other languages there was a different scene, but she said the publishing world was so tiny at that time. You did have to send your work to publishers in England. And when you look at this huge world of South Asian writing, and you're so robust now, and you think of the frail journeys that the first writers made, she would copy the addresses of the backs of the books on the bookshelf and send them out. And one day there was an answer from a man, quite an eccentric, I think, called Peter Owen, who was one man living in his old house in England with a typewriter. And Peter Owen was later credited for having brought in a lot of foreign authors, published them in Britain for the first time. But she didn't know how to be a writer, and down the road, I'm just telling anecdotes because it's fun. So right next door to her, she didn't, she was all on her own. She wanted to be a writer. You can tell why, because of these stories, that she was, inheritance of stories, right? Born of loss. But down the road, she would see a woman, a European woman, pushing a pram with babies in it. And this woman turned out to be Ruth Prawer Jhabwala, who you may know as a novelist, or you may know as the scriptwriter for Merchant Ivory Films. She wrote the script for many Henry James novels and for E.M. Foster's. No, did she write? She wrote for Room with a View. She won an Oscar for Room with a View. And she came from a family of German, Polish, Jewish background. The family had escaped to England. The immediate family, I think father, mother, brother, but she had lost, I think, full 40 members of her family in the death camps, and has written very movingly about it, saying just at the time when other authors were receiving their inheritance and discovering their inheritance, she was being disinherited. She suffered this enormous loss, but met an Indian architect, married him, came to live in Delhi, and my mother would borrow books from her, learned about the writing life from her. It was a profound friendship, because in these days we have events like this. In those days you didn't, and you had to and you have writers' residencies and writing schools and all the rest of it, but in those days you didn't at all. So I'm always very moved when I think of those early journeys. And if you read Achinua Achebe in Nigerian story, the Nigerian author, similar. He sent his only copy of Things Fall Apart to London to have it typed, because he thought you have to have a typed manuscript before you can even submit it. So he sent it to a typing agency, and they put it in a corner and never planned to type up Things Fall Apart, and never planned to send it back to Nigeria. And I think he had a friend, an English woman who worked for the Nigerian broadcasting, whatever it was, radio, found it lying in this dusty corner and rescued it. Yeah. And it was his only copy, and you think the world didn't have Things Fall Apart, and look at the world of Nigerian writing today, and this is what it was based on, this frail, frail, frail journey.
It's very strange to sit here and to have everyone looking there as if the cricket match was going on there. It's like, what's going on? Why are they looking there?
The last festival I attended, it was the worst timing of all. It was in London, and it was World Cup soccer. It was the soccer and Wimbledon and July 4th. So no one was looking at the writers. Everyone was looking at Wimbledon and the soccer match.
No, we are very interested in what you're saying. Thank you so much. One thing I wanted to ask you about before, I hope there'll be time. Yeah, lovely. Is, I had a writer residency, since you're talking about residencies, 2 years ago. I took Inheritance of Loss with me, but it's such a fine book that I did not dare to open it because I thought it would paralyze me with fear. And then last year, though, I went on another trip, and this time I read it more carefully. And so I want to ask Kiran a little bit, if you guys are also interested in hearing about the process. One thing that's wonderful is that there are so many different worlds being brought together, and the movement is very fleet. She's very quick. And small passages make up a dense, elaborate narrative, bringing together continents and entirely different people. Cool? So I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit about what your editing process is like, and also how the hell you manage to be so funny. How do you work on it, or does it come very naturally? Because I want to have that talent.
Amita, the darkest life produces the most jokes. You know this.
Wow, 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 wow.
Your life?
Talk about editing.
Editing. I do not recommend that anyone should follow my writing process because it is the most foolish process in the world. The reason I am so slow, I haven't published a book since, 2006?
Such a great
So long. But it's not that I haven't been writing. I write every day of my life. And I write through the weekends, and I write in the morning, and I write in the evening. But I work by producing mountains of material in every direction, following every story, every character. I keep diaries, I keep journals, which I think you do too from reading about your writing process. And then eventually, I look at this mass of material, which could be some 5,000 pages long, and find lines, echoes, discover the subject of my work that way. It sort of comes to me indirectly. And then it becomes a process of, I never expected in Inheritance of Loss I thought I would be writing an immigrant New York novel with the stories I was hearing all around in the streets of New York and the people I'd met there. I never expected to go back to the photograph that we had of my grandfather with a wig on his head holding court under the trees in a small village in Uttar Pradesh. And the book became a process of discovering these echoes, from that time to this time, globalized days, migration at this time, journeys in the past. How are they different? How do they echo each other? What are the emotional parallels between my journey, my grandfather's? Different classes. I grew it that way, trying to include as many voices as possible because, as we all know, there's that very famous John Berger line, quoted by many authors, including Arundhati Roy and God of Small Things and Michael Undate. No longer can one story be told in isolation.
As if it were the only story. Great. Now, before we take questions from the audience, I want you to take back what you said, because I don't want to have to talk about this with my therapist, about Indian men and that I only call for, instruct other women to be cooking.
No,
It is true I've served you a half-cooked fish once, but the lamb, do you remember the lamb?
I remember the lamb, and it was not a half-cooked fish.
Okay, some questions.
It was an entire snapper.
Questions from the audience, comments, sir.
Thank you. It was very nice to hear about your novel and what you write. I've been curious about one thing. In your case and many other novelists, the characters represent maybe yourself or somebody you know, but how about the interaction between the characters, the way they interact with each other? Is that also, because the interaction between two people may be different in different circumstances. The lines you read about Una, the way Una is responding, that depends upon how the other person is receiving the response. So do you dream of it, or do you think that's how it should be, or that's how it is? Thank you.
I imagine these conversations in my mind. Sometimes they're based on real things that I've overheard, or real, not often based entirely on people I know, but sometimes mixtures and bits and pieces of, I work like a magpie, collecting information in that way. And so then I just, these conversations, it tends to, you follow them as far as they go. You try and imagine the voices in your head and you follow them as far as they go. And sometimes people say they ring true, and sometimes people say they don't ring true. As a writer, you have to be aware of that criticism as well. Do I think it's how they interact? It's how I've imagined they interact.
Cool. Thank you. The lady in the front here.
Hi. One thing that I have thought about in reading your work is kind of not only the historical factors that you talk about and the importance of happenstance or the individual journey, but there seems to be a strong component of the individual personality in interaction with historical or structural factors. You get the strong sense that had this character been a different person, their life journey might have been different. And I wonder how you think about deciding what happens to your characters, how much of that is driven by who they are, and how much of that is driven by the world they encounter.
Very heavy questions today.
Yes, very serious for Sunday morning. Well, I think a play between both those things, right? Because first of all, we all inhabit just an accident of birth where we happen to be born, what our lives will be like. But I think my focus really is on following a personal story through history, through these historical events, because very influenced by someone like Marquez, who, in his work suggests that history is always someone's story. It's always someone's mixture of folk tale, mixture of real events, but it's always someone's story. And this is a point, Rushdie made in an Indian context as well, in Midnight's Children.
Someone else? There's another hand up here. Maybe you can pass the mic. Okay. All the folks who are wearing Indian clothes get first preference here. Whether you're white or brown doesn't matter. Okay, go ahead.
My father-in-law was born in Lahore, and my mother-in-law in Amritsar. And so just about 20 years ago, they finally started talking about their memories of partition and the things that they saw, terrible things. And my husband's family has zero interest in hearing these stories. But I am a mother with 2 children. Perhaps someday we'll have grandchildren. I feel it's really important to record this for the future generations. What is your recommendation of how I can respectfully do that for someone who is not originally from this culture?
I think it is important to record these stories, and my grandparents never spoke about any of this either. I didn't know my mother's parents, but my father's I did, and they never ever referred to this. Nor did my parents. They never talked about this time, and it was almost taboo. Had I known how important these stories would be to me and how important it has been to know my grandfather and grandmother, it's strange. Every single book seems to start on that veranda in Allahabad. I don't know how it is, but it was that important for me to know them. Every book's journey seems to start in that same place. But they never spoke. These stories had I known, I would have pressed them. And I think you seem like a very respectful person. I can't imagine they would be offended. But I think there's also a more formal project. What is it called, Amitava? You probably know of it.
There is a woman called Achal Malhotra, who started a project, a partition project, and there's also a museum being built. Willie, do you remember what's that young lady's name? The Bahari. Yeah, Achal. It's called, but her name is Achal Mehrotra, and she presents those stories also on Instagram. Everyone she's interviewing tells their story, and it's a wonderful record already. So it's a wonderful thing. But the other thing is, if I might interject, is one of those children will do an MFA, and then you'll see the story come out. Acha, some other question? There's a gentleman at the back, and then at the back there.
I'd like to say I'm just blessed that you're here.
Thank you so much.
You came into my life. I was teaching, tutoring English in Taiwan, and a very bad student was assigned to read Inheritance of Loss during the summer. And he was such a bad student that he couldn't really read by himself, so we read through together. And that was it. I'm a musician and a political activist, and these days I feel I'm not able to make much music because of the situation in our country. And I'm just wondering for you, as an artist who must receive demands to speak and use your power of expression to communicate about important world issues, do you feel any tensions yourself?
I do. I feel tremendous tensions because there are, I think, authors and writers and artists are becoming so politically active these days, and rightfully so. And I was told by a very dear friend who is very fiercely involved in politics these days. She said, "You have a voice and you should be using it." And then I'm torn because I've been working on this book for a decade, which is already embarrassing, but I know that the minute I step out of it, I lose it. And it is a very difficult, I think, decision. So I try and get half involved in projects, most recently centered on centered in India on the sort of seems like an epidemic of rapes. But then I find I lose my book immediately. There's that. And also as an author, I think sometimes you almost record things after the event. You write about things that have passed rather than influencing what's happening. You're noticing the effect of this presidency and this time on people all around. And again, I do keep a diary of, so I have all of that information. I'm not losing it, but at the same time, it is very difficult, and I think I feel very guilty all the time that I'm not a more politically active author.
Thank you.
There's a lady there. In orange, I won't say saffron.
You can say saffron. Thank you very much. And I was just curious about some of your favorite poets and poets that you're reading, maybe even both of you right now.
You go first.
नहीं सवाल भी नहीं सुना.
Oh, so the question is what poets especially, did you say, right? Which poets do you read? Let me think of the poets I read. Borges I quoted at the beginning of my last book, but I'm fond of reading people like Octavio Paz is important to me because I go to Mexico a lot and I love the connections he makes with India. Romantically, I love reading Turkish poet Nazim Hikmat, those beautiful books of poetry. Who else? Amitava, help me out. Say some.
Well, these days, because of especially what's happening with race relations, Claudia Rankine's Citizen, especially because it's a departure from traditional poetry and does things in prose poems and also with reportage, I always want to introduce that to my students. So that's one name, Claudia Rankine's Citizen. But there's so many others. The latest person, there's one which is this is also a response to the gentleman who was earlier asking about how to respond to the present. It is called Sonnets of Assassination or something like that. It's a finalist for the National Book Award right now, written by a wonderful poet called Terence Hayes, Hayes. So check it out.
Yeah, I think poets are becoming very politically active right now, right? There are lots of, well, they're lucky. Their form is just shorter.
Someone else?
About your book,
Anchal Malhotra. Remnants of a Separation. Yeah, that's for the lady here.
Hands up,
Yeah.
please, so we can see you. If you have questions.
Willie Dalrymple, please raise your hand before you speak. Acha bhai, any?
Someone there.
Sir, Mr. Winchester, please tell us one of your stories and then ask
No,
me.
I'm not going to tell
I've
a
heard you're a
story.
great storyteller.
Be quiet.
Please, please, please.
No. The only time I've been invited to the Jaipur Festival Willie, fix that, please. Were 2 years ago, and one of the sessions was utterly dominated by Shashi Tharoor, utterly destroying the British Empire. And regarding Winston Churchill as one of the most evil, genocidal people that had ever
I have heard him on YouTube.
Well, exactly. So I wanted to ask you a question I'm sure you've been asked many times, particularly at places like Cheltenham and other festivals. What do you think now, two
Of the
generations
British
on,
Empire?
of the British Empire? And I warn you, I won't warn you at all.
I
Just-
mean, I wish we could blame everything on the British Empire still, but unfortunately, I think we've got enough homegrown disasters that we can only blame ourselves for at this point.
That's a quick answer. Can I add to that? I think one thing we can certainly blame the British Empire for is Shashi Tharoor's accent.
Just because we whipped your ass at cricket last night.
Gosh, luckily I don't follow cricket. I had no idea.
India, by the way, has just won the match by 9 wickets.
Yes.
Yes, of course you will.
That is something I failed to ask them before, but Kiran and Amitabha will be signing books downstairs after this session. So you can just go right to the bottom of the stairs and you will see them. You can buy their book on one side of the hall and take it across the other side and have it signed. Are there any other questions? We still have a few minutes.
Can't I exercise privilege and ask her to read from Inheritance of Loss? Just a couple minutes?
You know what, Amitabh, I think it's too late. I think we don't have time.
We have time. We have an eternity.
Maybe
How
I'll
many
read-
times has a questioner said to
Why
you,
don't I read the little
The time you
passage
entered
about
my
the
life.
Englishman coming to Mehroli for Willie's because he asked me to read it
Say.
at breakfast.
Okay, bilkul, bilkul.
And I'll just read it for a few. I hope I can
You want
not
to please
carry on
Willie? No
forever.
problem.
But just stop me. Amitabha, just tell me when it's time to stop.
Don't worry about it.
1:55. Just a minute, I have to find him by
Okay, well,
name.
she's looking for that. Can I request no one should tweet about my remark about Shashi Tharoor on Twitter because that man is always on Twitter. Now, don't tweet that either, okay?
He'll find out.
Okay, at least if you're going to tweet it, at least don't misquote me. I said the one thing we can blame the British Empire for is Shashi Tharoor's accent.
Because he was not educated.
Because
Where
when
was he educated?
because he had once flown when he was in utero over England, and as we know from the Mahabharata, from Abhimanyu, when he was in his mother's womb, he learned how to penetrate the certain circle in war, but he didn't know how to come out in that same way. So it's a part of our traditional mythological inheritance of gains.
Okay, so So, when Papa became a follower of poetry and a scholar of history, he longed to tell someone of what he'd learned, and he remarked to Sonia, this is his daughter, "You see, Sonu, in the Bible, after God creates the world, God says, 'I want it to be known.' That is why he creates man, a profound point. Do you see? God was lonely. And lurking in the 'I want it to be known' is, of course, 'I want it to be praised.' Papa discovered he enjoyed accompanying Sonia, she works in a travel agency, to greet special guests who checked into the Imperial Hotel, breaking the self-imposed exile he'd adopted when his wife left him. The mother has left the husband, her father's left. Well, parents are separated. He suggested a bit shyly, if any of your tourists are interested in going to Mehroli, for example, why hire one of those phony guides? You know, the bakwas bloopers and false stories they feed them, charlatan tales of prophecies and the curses of sages. I'll be glad to show some of your visitors around. When Sonia mentioned an absent-minded artist by the name of Edmund, who had ventured to the Black Hat Monastery of the Karmapa in Sikkim, unaware he didn't have a travel permit for that region, and settled with his easel and paint box upon a folding stool he'd brought along, Papa's sympathy and interest was aroused. Edmund had been arrested, detained, his passport had been confiscated. The British embassy was trying to help, but he was temporarily stranded. The fact he'd been tramping about the Himalayas with a watercolor box reminded Papa of Sonia's grandfather and the foreigners who used to come to India in the old days. You'd get some fine people then, erudite, curious. They don't make them like that anymore. Papa accompanied Sonia to the Lutyens' House Hotel to meet Edmund, who was telling his passport woes to the lady who ran the establishment, her legs up on a mora in the garden, dahlias in pots all around. "Good afternoon, Edmund," he said in his best English accent. "I was told of your mishap, and I came to say that if you are at a loose end, I can show you around Delhi one morning." Without Mama around, there was no reason for him to feel jealous of other men, especially of foreigners. Edmund had white hair, but his face was like a child's. His round cheeks had an excited flush. He was soft-spoken. Papa liked him. "How kind of your father," Edmund said to Sonia. "Papa, just don't do anything to embarrass me," warned Sonia. Off he putt-putted in his little white Peugeot to collect Edmund the next morning, and Papa informed him straight away. "You're staying at the Lutyens Hotel, Edmund, so let me tell you about Lutyens. Nothing but bunk. I'll show you now that you have a little time. First, we'll drive by Rashtrapati Bhavan, and you can observe the mockery of a dome that is Lutyens' dome." He tried to copy the Indian dome, but he failed. He produced a dung plop. "Next, we'll go to Humayun's tomb, and you can see a true dome. You see, Edmund, the Indian dome is feminine in its aspect. In some parts of the Islamic world, the dome and the minarets are masculine and militaristic, resembling warheads. I don't care for them. Ours have always been graceful, like a breast or a pearl." Humayun's tomb was in the midst of a scrubbing being undertaken by the Aga Khan Foundation, so the dome looked bald and embarrassed. They were remaking the gardens into geometrical shapes. They were going to floodlight the monument. "Why are they doing this? Idiots, gadhas, they should leave it wild. I'm going to write to the Aga Khan." To seek out a place that remained its true self, he took Edmund to the Dargah of Nizamuddin Aulia. It was crowded with pilgrims and beggars, with women tying red threads about the marble jalis praying for a child. Edmund made several quick sketches when a crow dropped a curried mutton bone from a garbage heap right in his lap. He didn't even notice. Papa agitated about, meanwhile, making it clear to everyone around he was in charge of a foreigner basking in the stairs. Someone sidled up. "From where, sir, is your lovely wife?" "Edmund, he is a man. He's not my wife. But he has such delicate features." Papa saved this hilarity so he and Jeet might wring their laughter until they cried. The day went so well, he invited Edmund to dinner and hesitated only a moment before bringing out his prized Lafroig. Edmund had plenty of it where he came from, and Papa so very little. But still, if you are the host, you produce your best. You see, Edmund, when you visit a fort in Rajasthan, for example, you cannot uncover the plan. The mystery remains intact, how the rooms unfold, the secret passageways. You can't unlock the logic of why a balcony might open here, not there. You only see that it is beautiful and mysterious. And in fact, there is no logic, no symmetry. But when the British tried to copy the mystery, they drew up plans. It was a false mystery. They couldn't understand that the mystery must be attained without design. You cannot plot it. A great architect, like any artist, must disregard rational thought at times. Papa poured another drink. "Next time you come to India, forget hotels and tour groups. You come and stay with me, Edmund." They raised their glasses to toast the sunset, and Papa told Edmund that Ghalib called himself a Hindi writer, though he was not, for Hindi never rose and lived. It was a bloody useless language. He said at least in Pakistan they still had a language, although Urdu was the stupidest name for it. It meant camp, edifice, for it described a language of moving people who lived in never-ending expeditions, and Urdu contained Sanskrit, Arabic, Turkic, Persian. "You see, Edmund," he said, "there was a time, just imagine, when from the Balkans to China it was the same civilization. You can tell from the gateways they were of similar design, from Shiraz to Agra. You could go from town to town and your language would be understood." He said Humayun was a great astronomer, that in Jaipur to this day you could tell the time and study the planets using the instruments. that Jantar Mantar was created to correct the calendar that Westerners had to send out to China, to Samarkand, to understand astronomy. He said Tipu Sultan was the master of rockets, something the West only learned to make in the 1800s. He said some idiot of an Englishman came and gave all the Mughals phony titles. So-and-so the great, so-and-so the meek, so-and-so the brave, and like all stupid nicknames, they stuck. The same man wrote that Humayun stumbled through life and tumbled out of it, and rubbled a complex civilization he could not understand to schoolboy nonsense. He created an Indian history for idiots, and we're still perpetuating this, Edmund, because Indians are still slaves after 200 years of being slaves, for we're still being educated in the manner of Macaulay into anti-Indian idiots. He said there were no collectors of bronzes in the young generation, that the director of the National Museum was from the Indian Administrative Service, and how dare the administrators come into this field, for they were all educated to be anti-Indian in the first place. He said he himself had to learn to be Indian backwards, just like Nehru and Gandhi, who had once been proud to dance the foxtrot. He said that to his credit, Gandhi had had homosexual experiences and that his sex life never fit into Western norms, which were Victorian prudishness that had destroyed India. Victorian prudishness and a lack of imagination now informed the Hindu right. Little did the imbeciles understand that they were actually Victorian Britons and Nazis combined. Wearing short pants, doing gym exercises, and blowing upon whistles, you'd laugh if you hadn't witnessed how it repeatedly ended in mass murder. He recited a little Firaz, a little Firak, a little Firoz. Was it Firak who died at age 45? He was a flame, not a man, you see. He had no practical abilities at all and died on the roof of a liquor still. He said, you know, Edmund, I was lucky because I met the last of the great poets before they departed for Pakistan. If you appreciated their work, they took to you, and if you could answer their verse with verse, you were accepted into their circle. No matter who you were, they didn't care. Edmund, if you like, I'll take you to Jama Masjid tomorrow evening, but it's impossible to get through Old Delhi streets without your car getting scraped or dented. We'll park at a distance and take a rickshaw. Edmund was happy about the Lafroig and remarked the most perfect moments of his life involved listening to Ravi Shankar whilst looking upon the daffodils in his garden in England and sipping a single malt. Papa said his finest moments were drinking a single malt, listening to Beethoven's last sonatas, and watching the sun set right here in horse cars over the ruined mosque behind his flat, the mihrab rising into the sky, the trees beyond full of parrots, trying first one tree out for the night, then another. Thank you all very much.
That was beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiran. Thank you, Amitabha.